Hi, welcome to From Here Forward, a UBC Podcast Network podcast. I'm Romnique and she's Carol.
Hello, friendly alumni.
Carol.
Romnique.
We both graduated from UBC, and this pod frequently hosts UBC faculty and alumni. But what do we really know about our alma mater?
Absolutely nothing, besides the fact that they gave us our master's degree, which thanks so much for that.
It's never too late for them to take it back. Anyways, but what I realized after talking to our latest guests, Sheldon Goldfarb and Herbert Rosengarten, is that my UBC knowledge could really use some work. And there's actually a lot more to this place than meets the eye.
You know, I had a joke about the eye, but it kind of left me. But the conversation really affirmed this fact that I've known about myself, which is I really don't care about school spirit. I never have, never probably will. But it was really nice to meet people that actually care about an institution and know a lot of quirky facts. It was a lot of wholesome vibes.
Yeah, and if the university wasn't going to rescind our degrees after you said that you have no school spirit, I feel like they might be.
I am not painting my face with it. I don't even know what the school colors are, okay? I just went there for the education.
Well, the views of Carol do not reflect the views of Romnique Johal. Please don't take my degree away.
But before we get into the actual conversation, do you want to briefly explain who Sheldon and Herbert are?
Yes. So Sheldon and Herbert are both UBC profs, and they've both written books about the university and the university's history over the last 100 years or so. Sheldon Goldfarb is an archivist for the Alma Mater Society, and Herbert is a professor emeritus at UBC.
Amazing. So two smart people who we somehow convinced to talk to us. Cool. All right, let's jump in.
Speaking to two people who have experience at length, what are some maybe pieces of, or one fun fact each that you both kind of recall of trivia about the university?
Herbert and I have written a book on the history, and we weren't the first. There was Harry Logan's book in 1957, and then Herbert wrote the book. Here's a piece of trivia to celebrate one of the two centennials or centenaries of UBC, because UBC decided that 2008 was a good year to celebrate 100 years of UBC, because in 1908, the government of British Columbia passed a law saying there shall be a University of British Columbia. And so that was celebrated in 2008, although I said at the time to the UBC archivist, it was just a piece of paper. There was no actual university until 1915. And then in 2015, at the AMS, we decided we should celebrate that 100 years. Another piece of trivia in the book, I guess, would be that, and I mentioned this in my book, that there was a contest done, a sort of competition held by the UBC student newspaper at a time when Justin McElroy, who's gone on to bigger things, Justin McElroy was the editor. He liked to do these compilations, these like the best this, the best that, and he had a survey of UBC students. What is the most quintessential UBC experience? And it was like a brackets thing, like a basketball brackets. And it got narrowed down and narrowed down. And the winner eventually was Storm the Wall as the quintessential UBC experience, beating out some other quintessential experiences like sleeping in class, avoiding rain puddles, and making detours around construction.
Okay, so Carol, did you ever storm the wall?
No, I actually never did, but I was one of the people that watched and judged hardcore, because why would you want to do that to yourself?
Yeah, I also did not do it, but it's because I didn't have motivation to even show up, let alone climb things. So it really wasn't in the cards for me, unfortunately.
I mean, that's fair. The only wall that we ever stormed was getting to the bus loop every day, because that was a battle in itself. But what I found interesting, based on the conversation, was that UBC has been around since the World Wars, ? That is old.
She's a senior.
She is. So here's that conversation.
Well, it has been around for a fair amount of time now, since it opened its doors in 1915. Although it grew rather slowly at first, from the end of the Second World War onwards, it expanded quite rapidly into a major, first a provincial, then a national, and finally a major international university. And along with that growth comes all the bureaucracy, all the paperwork, all the records. We have a very big and very effective archives department at UBC. which holds so many of the records of the departments and the activities that have taken place here. And UBC has played quite a role in the history of the province too, so that you'll find articles about UBC going way back almost to, well, perhaps to its very beginnings. There's plenty of material out there for the historian. And I would say, and Sheldon, I'm sure, would agree.
Herbert's talking about the politics and the economics and that. My book, Herbert's book, was more overarching the university. And mine is, if you can, the subtitle is A History of Student Life. So I focused on what the students were up to every year, which is because I worked for the Student Society. And I went year by year. And so every year I talked about what the students were up to, hazing and initiation, electrocuting themselves, exciting things like that, throwing themselves in the ponds, or the engineers pulling off pranks, hanging Volkswagens from buildings, or putting out phony art and then smashing it. They did all sorts of things.
Oh, hazing. What is university without the stories of the glorious times of people being hazed and running around?
Truly, it is a part of the university experience.
It is. And, as much as we like to judge, the world was their oyster at the time, and so they thought they could just do whatever they wanted to do. But beyond the weird stuff, I didn't know that we had a former prime minister who attended UBC, not to mention, the other powerful people that we know in Canadian politics today. But it is cool that we had a PM.
We have Kim Campbell, for one, who was the first and only woman prime minister of Canada. She was a student here in the 60s, and she was on student council. She was a vice president. She was also president of the Frosh, the first-year students, a position that no longer exists. Also, we're not supposed to use the word Frosh anymore. That's another story. And she ran for election for president of the Frosh under the slogan, Kim is cuddlier. And she won election and got onto student council by being cuddlier, I guess, and was on council another time as the vice president, and then later rose through, was she in the Social Credit Party in BC? And then she was in the Progressive Conservatives federally and became prime minister very briefly. Student Council here has produced two prime ministers. There's a third one who wasn't on Student Council. Student Council has produced two prime ministers, both of whom served very short terms. The other one was John Turner, who was on Student Council in the 1940s. He was also an athlete. He was a sports writer for the UBC newspaper. He was known in those days as Chick Turner. I'm not entirely sure why. And then he went on to become known as John Turner and became prime minister very briefly in 1984, succeeding Pierre Elliott Trudeau. The other one who was a student here but not on student council was our current prime minister, Justin Trudeau, who was in the Faculty of Education, I think, for a year. So AMS Student Council has produced two actual prime ministers and the grandfather of another prime minister, James Sinclair, whose daughter, Margaret Sinclair, married Pierre Elliott Trudeau and became Margaret Trudeau or Maggie Trudeau. And then they had Justin way back in 1971, and then he became prime minister. So that's the prime ministerial connections at UBC and the AMS.
I like our odds. It also teaches me, Carol, that you need to be on student council if you want to start your political career. And being cuddly is a good politician's slogan, apparently. Who would have thought? Names are rarely given without reason, especially in institutions like UBC that are so long-standing. So what is the story behind how the UBC Thunderbirds came to be called the Thunderbirds?
So why are we the Thunderbirds? And we were almost the Seagulls, because at first, UBC didn't have a nickname, didn't have a mascot. It was just UBC. I mean, we played sports. We had a rugby team and I think hockey, and rugby was bigger than football in those days. Anyway, we had teams playing sports, but they had no nickname. And a sports editor on the UBC newspaper said, well, this is no good. We're playing against tigers and bears and lions, and their fans yell out, go Tigers, and we have to say, go University of British Columbia, and this is just awkward. And so he invited students to suggest names, and there was a vote, and there were lots of names suggested: Prowlers, Seagulls. He liked Thunderbirds. Anyway, there was a vote by the students, and they voted in favor of Seagulls. And the UBC sports department said, oh, you must be kidding. We're not going to call our team the Seagulls. So in the best traditions of democracy, if you don't like the results of one election, have another. So they had a second vote in which they really pushed Thunderbirds, and this time the Thunderbird won the election. And so, starting in 1934, Thunderbird was the name used by UBC's teams. Thunderbird being an indigenous term referring to a powerful mythical creature. And no one thought in those days to ask permission to use an indigenous term. And so that's where 1948 comes in. That's what Herbert was mentioning. At the homecoming football game, a Thunderbird football game in 1948, there was a chief from one of the indigenous groups, I can't remember which one now, Chief Scow, who officially gave permission to the AMS, which the AMS in those days, the students ran the athletics program.
Every university has a Latin motto that they've taken on for themselves, but UBC decided that it wanted to be super fancy and have its own unique motto.
I feel like UBC would be the kind of school that has its own fancy Latin motto.
I mean, she's bougie. Anyway, here's Herbert on that.
It's a good question because I think it came from the mind of our first president, Frank Westbrook, who worked with the College of Heralds in London to get a crest for the UBC. And of course, every crest has to have a motto. And I think he came up with that motto. I don't think if you look it up, I don't think it belongs or that it's taken from any famous classical text. But Frank Westbrook wanted to create a university for the people, as he said. And so he devised this Latin term, tuum est, meaning, well, some people say it means it is yours, meaning that the university belongs to the people who live, work, and study in the university. I think it's a very appropriate motto. Of course, it can also be and has been translated as it is up to you, sometimes rather ironically, but nonetheless, it stood the test of time, and I think we will continue to use it, although it doesn't appear as much as it used to do. It seems, I think, today to be rather old-fashioned to be quoting Latin mottos. Nonetheless, it's a part of the university's history.
It used to be on the UBC logo, where now you see the letters UBC, that's where it used to say tuum est. And I thought, when the university switched, I thought, oh, don't do that, but they didn't ask me, Keith. All right.
Yeah, I agree with you, Sheldon. It should be there, but I think it seems perhaps too old-fashioned to the people who run the show today.
I also find it interesting that UBC had a fancy Latin motto at the same time they were doing not so fancy things like hazing.
You know what they say, Rumnik? Do as the Romans did.
Nobody said that.
I'm kidding. But what really got... I feel like someone did say that. Whatever. Anyway, okay, what really got me was that some of the hazing practices included electrocution, literally with electricity. Here, Sheldon.
Well, I could show you a picture of the electrocution if I could find it here.
There were many times when I would like to have been able to use it myself, but not, I guess.
Oh, there it is. I don't know if you can see. You see that picture? That's somebody hooked up to a battery, two batteries, with current being run through them. And by electrocute, I don't mean they killed them. They got a little jolt. But this was around 1917, getting your initiation. And it was called initiation. There was the initiation into UBC, and people would be made to wear funny clothes. 1 year, I have a picture. 1 year, students are wearing green dunce caps, first-year students. They'd be required to sing the UBC songs. There's a song, Hail UBC, and the students don't do this anymore. Anyway, or they'd be made to go on their hands and knees and have cold cream rubbed on their faces and all sorts of activities that, I don't know, were supposed to make you a better person or better able to attend university. The authorities kept saying, don't do these things. And even the AMS Student Council said, we're going to ban it.
Well, I think if you talk to people in the fraternities, such as they are today, I think most of the fraternities have disappeared. That's the place where these things may have survived. But in most places in Canada and the US, these practices have been severely discouraged because they've often led to very serious consequences. While there's possibly there's a survival of that practice in secret, it's not something that is talked about anymore. But hazing was a way of becoming part of the in-group. And I mean, you can understand the motive behind it, but it's not found, or it's very rarely practiced now. Thank goodness, I think.
And there's less of the pranking than there was. Partly the demographics have changed. In the old days, the engineers were all young men who liked to get drunk, or at least like to drink. I think they prided themselves on not getting drunk, but their song was, we are the engineers, we can demolish 40 beers. So I've spoken to an engineer recently, who said, oh yeah, I did my 40 beers, but there's a lot more women in engineering now. I think that's changed the culture. There's no more Lady Godiva ride, that's for sure. That's where the engineers paraded a naked woman around campus riding on a horse in honor, supposedly, of Lady Godiva in the medieval era. And that stopped, interestingly. There was lots of complaints about that. There were lots. AMS Council, told the engineers don't do this, and tried to impose penalties. The university administration tried to impose penalties. Nothing really stopped it until 1989, when sadly you had the massacre in Montreal of the women engineering students. And after that, the engineers stopped, and they said, we didn't think this was appropriate anymore. So, one good thing out of that, although that was a horrible thing. And I don't know, the engineers, they pulled off some great pranks in the past. They were often hoisting Volkswagens. They even went down to San Francisco. They attached a Volkswagen to the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. And surprisingly or not, the authorities in San Francisco were not impressed, were not happy, didn't like this. More recently, the engineers have not been successful in, they got caught a couple of times trying to put up Volkswagens. So there you go.
Here's my favorite part of the conversation. So I'm not sure if I was the only one who didn't know, but there was a literal sex crusade in the 70s. How about that?
Yeah, how about that? And I think I personally could have lived without asking Herbert or Sheldon about this because I am extremely awkward. But my girl Carol never shies away from literally anything.
Okay, but you have to admit, at a university, sex crusade, those are things that you would never put in one sentence. Anyway, here's that history.
So the Campus Crusade for Christ was looking for recruits, people to become born-again Christians. And they paraded around campus with signs saying dynamic sex. And when asked, they said, well, if you become a Christian, if you come to Jesus, that's what you will get, dynamic sex. And the Lutheran minister on campus said, that's not Christianity. But anyway, so that was the dynamic sex thing. That was just a sort of campaign slogan by a born-again Christian group wanting to recruit followers. But quite amusing, I thought. Did it work? Oh, in what sense? Did it produce dynamic sex? I can't vouch for that. Did it win them recruits? It got them publicity. I don't know if it got them recruits.
I think it was actually the title of a lecture in a series of lectures given by the campaign that Sheldon's referring to, and they were using it as he says, as a means of attracting students to the campaign crusade. I think there were 3 or 4 lectures in the week, and this was going to be sort of, if you'll excuse the term, the climax of the series. And so, was it successful? Yes, it drew people in, and it actually, I think it got a front page article in the UBC. So you'd have to say it was successful.
Yeah, and clearly we're still talking about it because that definitely got Carol's attention, to say the least.
That's right. 50 years later. Yes.
Not to take a hard pivot from sex crusades, but since Romnique and I never stormed the wall, we wanted to ask Herbert and Sheldon how this became a UBC tradition.
It's a bit controversial when it started, because if you go to Storm the Wall now, they talk about having begun in 1978. And so when I did my book, I thought, okay, let's get Storm the Wall in the book. Let's look at the newspaper in 1978 and find out, the first Storm the Wall. There was nothing, and nothing in 1979. The first time I could find Storm the Wall was 1980. And then I spoke to Nestor Korchinski. Nestor Korchinski is the longtime head of intramurals. He was the one who brought Storm the Wall to UBC. And I said, Nestor, I don't understand. I can't find any evidence from these first 2 years. It's supposed to have started in 1978. And he thought about that and he said, oh, yeah, I told them we started in 1978, but I realize now that's a mistake. They first heard about Storm the Wall was at some other university. Someone in the intramurals department or the athletics department was at another university, visiting another university, and saw that they had this Storm the Wall competition, running, climbing walls, swimming, whatever. I've never done it myself, so I don't know. And thought, let's do it at UBC. And Nestor thought it was a good idea, but it took them a year to plan it. And then they were ready to go in 1979, in the fall of 1979. But people said, we already have so many events in the fall every year. Like there was something called the Arts Relay. And now there is there's a trek race too, I think. Anyway, they said, why don't we wait till the spring and we'll do it in the spring? And so the first one was actually in the spring of 1980. I've tried to convince the Storm the Wall people that, so you really began in 1980, and they say, oh, okay, but they still say 1978. So that's how Storm the Wall began.
I remember many years ago going with some concern or other to visit with the vice president's students. I think the office was then called the Student Affairs, and sitting in her office, waiting, and she didn't show up for ages. And then finally the door opened and in she comes. This was Maria Clave, who was former head of computer science at UBC, and then subsequently VP students, and then Dean of Science. And in each case, the first woman to hold those appointments. She was about half an hour late for the appointment. She was, I know it's not appropriate to say this about a woman, but she was covered in sweat. She was wearing shorts and a tank top shirt. And she apologized for keeping us waiting because she'd just been storming the wall. And I think she'd been part of the computer science team. I don't know how they did, but I figured if they had managed to persuade the VP students to join their team, they had a very good chance of winning, no matter how well they actually stormed the wall. Maria Clave, incidentally, was a very vigorous, a very energetic vice president and dean. She's gone on to be president of Harvey Mudd College in California, which is quite a big deal. But in any case, she was the first, and as far as I know, probably the only vice president at UBC who has stormed the wall.
Romnique and I are former journalism students, like we like to say every single episode. So we naturally wanted to ask about the UBC, or the UBC, however you pronounce that name, and why you cannot find a print copy from 1994.
The reason it didn't publish that year is because, well, you have to understand, the UBC newspaper started out as the newspaper of the AMS, of the Student Society, of Student Council. It was started in 1918, just 3 years after UBC opened, and the AMS was founded in 1915, just a couple of weeks after UBC opened. And for a while, the AMS published a monthly, a literary journal, and they had no name for it. They called it UBC, spelled differently, UBICEE. And then they decided they needed something more, up to date and not just once a month. So they said, we're going to get you the hot news every week. And they created a newspaper called the UBC, spelled the way it is now, UBYSSEY, which combines UBC, the university, with the Odyssey, because I guess they thought they could write like Homer or something like that. And so they were published for many years, and they were the AMS newspaper, and the AMS would name the editor, and that was fine for a while. But after a while, the newspaper began to gain a little bit of independence. Not real, officially they were part of the AMS, but they seemed to become very critical of the AMS. And also, especially in the 60s, the 60s were a wild time. If you want to ask about a wild time at UBC, it's the 60s. And, sex, drugs, rock and roll. The UBC became very radical. And from that time, culminating in the 90s, early 90s, the UBC the headlines would be raunchy or full of four-letter words. They'd run articles like how to get on the bus without paying. They'd run things that slandered AMS executives. The AMS began getting complaints from alumni saying, why is the student newspaper saying all these nasty things, and what's going on with that? And eventually, the AMS had enough and said, okay, we're going to step in. Officially, you're still our newspaper. Although what had happened over the years was the AMS deferred to the UBC staff and let the staff choose their own editor. The AMS Student Council said, okay, this year we're going to choose the editor. And they named an editor. And the staff at the UBC refused to work with them. And the editor anyway then said, I can't do this and stepped down. The AMS tried to find a second editor, but it also didn't work. And so essentially it was a stalemate. And for a whole year, there was no UBC newspaper. The other newspapers sprang up. There'd already been a rival newspaper, which was less radical, called Campus Times. It began publishing, and it was the only paper publishing in that, only student newspaper publishing in that year. And it's the paper the AMS would use to announce referendums and things like that. But eventually there became a movement to bring back the UBC and freedom of the press and whatever. And so there was the AMS agreed to hold a referendum at which students could vote to pay a fee directly to the UBC, and the UBC would be an independent entity. And the referendum passed, and the UBC came back to life, this time as an independent, not part of the AMS. And that was in the fall or the summer, maybe, of 95.
When we were looking for materials for the 100-year history of UBC, we also turned to the UBC newspaper quite often because it was often the only place where you could find any written documentation of a particular event, a speech, some kind of problem that had arisen. The UBC was often our only source, so it was very helpful to have that paper there. So yes, the UBC is sometimes a thorn in everybody's side, but by and large, I think it's been a great aid to, certainly to university historians, but also I think as a reflection of changing times, changing attitudes, and a source of a lot of fun and interest for everybody who uses it, who consults it.
That was a great piece of history and also describes the kind of journalism that I personally like to do, which involves being a thorn in people's sides.
It's true. I don't. I like to be the petal, but you like to be the thorn. But for a final word from Herbert and Sheldon directly, we wanted to know how they've seen UBC change over the many, 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 many years.
Well, I think UBC is a much more student-oriented university than it was when I first came here. But in terms of public perceptions of UBC by people outside the university, I think there are several times in its history when perhaps changing demographics, changing politics have affected the way it's appeared to the world. But UBC was, even then, the major university in the province, and it attracted all the best students from the high schools and so on. It was the place where everybody wanted to send their kids. But it was a provincial university. It wasn't until David Strangway came that we started to look beyond our borders and to think of ourselves as having an impact nationally, because David Strangway brought with him a very strong research orientation. He wanted UBC to be at the forefront of research, particularly in science. And his own background as a geologist working for NASA, I think, inspired him with that. And he pushed UBC into expanding in the area of scientific research in ways that it hadn't dreamt of doing before. So starting around the mid-80s onwards, I think UBC started to make its weight felt in national councils in terms of getting research scientists to come here by winning large grants, by winning contracts, by becoming a force to be reckoned with as a source of scientific discovery. And I think that's probably how UBC sees itself today, as a major research engine and a university not with just a national, but with an international impact.
It's dramatically changed now. Now we have an Indigenous Culture Month. Now there was an Indigenous student elected president of the AMS 20 years ago, but more recently than that, there's been an acceleration in the most recent referendum we held. We created a constituency just for Indigenous students. So like you've got arts, science, engineering, and now you'll have the Indigenous students. So that definitely changed from the early days. After the 60s, in the 70s, things changed like that. The demographics of the university changed too. For one thing, there were like 400 students in year one, and now there are 60,000. But also the ethnic diversity. I mean, if you take a look at the AMS executive now, they're all Asian, whereas if you look 50 years ago, they're all white. So there's been quite a change there too.
Well, that was a lot of fun. And now I'm going to tell everyone I know that UBC had sex crusades, because that's what I obviously took away from this conversation.
I resent that they told us that, because you are never going to let this go.
Nope. And I may be 26, but I'm still 19 at heart. In all seriousness, I think this conversation does go to show that sometimes the most random and interesting places are in your backyards. Or so I think the saying goes. Any last insightful comments from Ramneek Johal?
I would just say stay curious. Oh, and tum est, or whatever, and however it's pronounced.
Oh, that was the motto.
Carol, thank you for finally joining us in the year of 2023.
I was like, what is she saying? Well, tickle me inspired.
I don't want to tickle you, actually. Thanks everyone for listening. Make sure you catch our next episode by subscribing or following our show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're feeling the feels, please drop us a review. You can also find me on Twitter at Ramneek with 3 E's.
And me at Carol Eugene Park.
Today's episode was recorded at CITR Radio and engineered by Hina Imam. From Here Forward is an alumni UBC podcast produced by Podium Podcast Company.